that I get to share some of the work that we've done in Scotland, where I started working on this topic 12 years ago, but also together with campaigns of researchers in lots of other countries. Because when the voting age was lowered to 16 in Scotland, I wasn't sure whether I thought that this was a good or a bad idea. I wanted empirical social scientists, and he wanted to analyze and see what happens. So I will talk a bit about this. What does happen? What have we seen in a number of countries around it? But I don't just want to talk about the young people, but also have a look at what happens beyond that to political debates and the views that adults have. And finally, ask the question of, is it just about lowering the voting age per se, or does this ask of us other questions of how to implement it well? But let's start with the experiences. Now, I think the great thing is that nowadays we have data on this. When the debate started in the UK in the early 2010s, that's the sort of newspaper headlines you've got. Basically, people saying, my child should not do this. But it wasn't based on any analysis, any data, any research. It was all anecdotes. And typically the sort of stories and anecdotes that were very, very disparaging of young people. We've also seen more academic studies at the time, and the big government commissioned report by the Electoral Commission in the UK, and they all came out against votes at 16. But the problem is that the analyses weren't about votes at 16. The analysis were about 18 to 24-year-olds. 18 to 24-year-olds were typically the group participating least in elections, and therefore the argument was if we gave the voting age to 16, 17-year-olds, it would get even worse. The other argument that was often used was, well, 16, 17-year-olds on average answer slightly fewer factual questions correctly about politics. Again, analytically the question is, but could votes at 16 have a causal effect on them? Could something change? So we can only study votes at 16 when votes at 16 is implemented. The good thing is, we now have more and more examples where we can empirically study what happens when votes are lowered to 16. As we just heard, several Latin American countries were actually the trailblazers on this, including in the democratic transition in Brazil, for example. But we now have more examples from other countries. Austria, one of the countries with the most comprehensive lowering since 2007. We have several Länder in Germany, but some at different levels, some only municipal, some higher. It's always complicated in Germany. And obviously Scotland, for example, amongst others. So this is where we started studying things. Initially, votes at 16 was introduced in Scotland for the Scottish independence referendum of 2014, where Scotland decided to stay part of the United Kingdom in the end. But one of the remarkable features of that referendum was that the voting age was lowered to 16 with the support of some independence supporting parties and some independence opposing parties. Now this gave us a fantastic opportunity for a kind of natural experiment. After the referendum in 2015, leading up to the next UK-wide general election to the House of Commons, we did a representative survey of 16 and 17-year-olds in Scotland and our UK, the rest of the UK, so England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, who didn't at that point have the experience of votes at 16. And what was striking is that both in terms of hypothetical voting likelihood, whether they would be likely to turn out in an election, non-electoral political participation, or their information source engagement, the Scottish youngsters were basically at much higher levels. That didn't mean, however, that they became complacent. So on the question, is politics too difficult to understand for me? As many of the young Scots said this as in the rest of the UK, 60% said, yes, politics is difficult. But, and that was the interesting thing, they had much greater confidence in themselves. 2/3 of Scottish 16, 17-year-olds after the introduction said that 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote in all elections, compared to only half in the rest of the UK. And that's a quite common thing. Before it is introduced, young people themselves are often very skeptical of votes at 16. We've done a lot of qualitative works in schools around this though. And one of the big reasons is that young people question their own ability or the ability of their classmates, not that idiot kind of view. But what we see is actually that very often in conversations that changes when they see other young people engaged in politics. So there's often a peer effect that otherwise doesn't exist. And we could obviously also ask the question, do they think their uncles, aunts, grandparents, and so on are actually politically capable? When you ask that, often a lot of reflection happens. And usually there's an uncle that they think shouldn't be voting. So there's also a process of kind of thinking, a degree of criticality that I would say is actually quite good. That question of can I do something? It's obviously bad if therefore people don't feel ultimately enabled to do this. Having said that, the Scottish independence referendum was obviously a very specific moment in history. It was heightened engagement across the entire level. Now, we did some analyses, and it was interesting that we didn't see the same level of difference between Scottish adults and rest of UK adults. So it seemed to be something specific to 16, 17-year-olds. But you never know. That might have been still something in the aftermath of the referendum. So we did a longer-term study in 2021, 7 years later. Now, since then, the voting age has been lowered for all elections within Scotland. So in 2015, the Scottish Parliament legislated to vote the voting age for all elections to 16, except for the UK Parliament, of course, which is still at 18 because it's a UK-wide decision. So we've been able to study what happened basically in Scotland to young adults, some of whom had their first election at 16, some of whom's first election, however, was the election to the UK Parliament, so they still had voting age 18. So we could compare different groups at different ages. Obviously, this is the normal pattern that we would expect. Yeah? In early adulthood, we typically see a dip in turnout, and then it starts picking up later again, for the many reasons that you're probably familiar with already. This sort of young people moving out of the home and having their first electoral experience individualized rather than collective with peers or family. So all the sort of things we know are problematic in terms of shaping turnout. This is the pattern in Scotland in 2021 for 16 to 31-year-olds. And this is really, really interesting because it is not the picture we would have normally expected or that we used to see in Scotland. Traditionally, we saw that classic view. What you see is the solid blue color. Those are young people who were enfranchised at their first election, at an election where the voting age was 18. In kind of the dashed blue, those are the young people whose first election was one in which the enfranchisement is 16 or 17. Now, we're still seeing a dip in the early 20s, but what you see here is also a surprising kind of bump in the middle amongst young people whose first vote was at 16. We also do see that there's still differences by election. LE stands for local election. Local elections have lower turnouts regardless of whether this is your first election in kind of older age 18, or younger, it's a vote 16 election. But it is quite striking. We can also obviously, I won't show you all this right now, but there's a paper coming out soon, where we put this into regression models, we control for people's socioeconomic background in their family, their gender, and the age, and look at is there still an effect of whether your first election says voting age 16 or 18, and it is there. It's a significant and quite substantial effect. And that even holds if we exclude current 16 and 17-year-olds. So if I run these regressions only for 18 to 31-year-olds, we still find that effect. And we're controlling for age, so we're controlling for that age effect in there as well. So basically what we're finding are two things in Scotland in 2021. Like in 2014-15, 16 and 17-year-olds turn out in higher rates than 18 to 19 or 20 to 21-year-olds. That's a finding we have in a lot of countries. But also, there is some follow-through into early adulthood. In other words, there's still a dip, but the dip starts from a higher baseline and doesn't go as deep. And that is something we found in other countries as well. So this is from a book that Johannes Berg from Oslo and I have co-edited, in which people looked at that experience in multiple countries, and the data from Latin American countries, as well as the data from Austria that our colleague Mark Franklin analyzed, showed a similar effect, that there was some carry-through effect of that voter boost, especially in Austria as well. And just to show you another example where we see a similar indication, this is from Germany. Again, in Germany, you have some of the 16 states in Germany, some of the Länder, in which the voting age is 16 for Länder elections. You have some where the voting age is 16 only for local elections. You have some where it's 18 for everything. And now, we'll hear from Belgium in a moment, obviously in all German states it's 16 for the European Parliament elections. But this is from the 2021 German federal elections, so no European elections at 16 yet. So we could compare what happened in the different states of Germany. Overall, which was quite nice in 2017, if we compared the German elections from 2017 to 2021, we saw an increase in youth voter participation. But have a look where the increase is the biggest. It is the biggest across all young adult voter groups. It's biggest in those states that had the voting age 16 at state level. So they're the ones at the left. So across all age groups up to 29, those young people who had been enfranchised at 16 for state elections showed a greater increase on average. Obviously, there's variation within young. Not all young people are the same, we're talking about averages here. But it was quite a striking result once again. The final point about what happens when we implement kind of votes at 16 is that question, obviously, how do young people vote? Now in Scotland we have a lot of evidence that suggests young people are not particularly swayed by their parents. Parents are important in terms of whether you vote or you don't, but less so in who you vote for, at least compared to 20, 30 years ago. That sort of transmission is much less strong. But there was a second question, it's about voter competency, it's sometimes called. Now I'm always a bit careful with this, because a lot of political science analysts say, if you are in a certain social class, you should vote for that party. I find that problematic, because when you have many, many motivations that might lead you to vote for something. There's great instruments in Germany, it sounds so German, the Wahlomat. And it's something that it's used by the German, produced every year by the German public education authorities. It's basically an instrument. All political parties answer about 30 to 35 policy questions. You answer the same questions and you see your match. You can weight some questions higher, lower, what's important to you, you get a match. A lot of people use that as a heuristic. It's used by millions of people in Germany each year. So a colleague at the University of Erfurt, Anna Lang, did a really fascinating study with a sample of 16, 17-year-olds, sample of the rest of the population. They all answered the policy questions ahead of the elections for the European elections. And then she matched those with the party policy preference to see whether young people were as good or as bad as the rest of the population of picking the party that maximized their policy preferences. And basically, it's the same. There's no difference between those voter groups in Germany. So when we look at this, it doesn't mean young people are perfect. Many of them, had a big mismatch between policy preference and party, but the mismatch was in some instances smaller or equal to the rest of the adult population. So when we look at it, I would summarize the findings from multiple countries as when you implement votes at 16, we have very little evidence that anything bad happens. We really haven't found that. But we have several countries in which quite a few good things have happened as well. And what I mean by good things is also that these sorts of media stories, the way we talk about young people, in some of those instances have been positively affected. Because public opinion also changed. So before the introductions of votes at 16 in Scotland, only about 30% of the adult population supported votes at 16. This is shortly after the introduction, 5 months later. Support for votes at 16 in Scotland was 50%. Later in 2015, the Electoral Commission did another survey. Support had gone up to about 60%. And that's where about we find it in Scotland, 55 to 60% support for votes at 16, which is quite a common finding. And that is partially because people, realized obviously the world didn't stop when 16-year-olds voted, nothing dramatic happened. But, and I'll come back to the implementation, when implemented well, actually there can be a positive impact on how young people are talked about. In Scotland, for example, we saw a lot of in-depth media studies. BBC Scotland ran special events showcasing young people, which they've never done before. Happy to discuss this a bit more in the discussion. I worked with BBC Scotland on this as a consultant, and there was a real interest in this. But also, political support can change. We often assume that votes at 16 is unpopular with conservative politicians. Now, that was the case in Scotland. The Conservatives were the only party that objected to votes at 16 initially, but they changed their mind. In 2015, the voting age in Scotland was lowered by all political parties. It was a unanimous decision. The then leader, Ruth Davidson, said two reasons. One, 16, 17-year-olds in the Scottish independence referendum turned out at 75% compared to just under 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds. So instead, finding again, she was like, okay, we see this in practice. But she said, we've seen a lot more young people politically engaged because of some of those positive peer effects. And she also realized that there are a lot of young people who actually agree, policy preference-wise, with her party, but didn't vote for her because they said to them, we're not interested in you. We know young people are very open to all political parties if political parties reach out to them, because young people have as heterogeneous political views as everyone else. And we see this in Germany. In Germany, we have now several states in which Christian Democrat-led or participating governments have agreed to lower the voting age, including the most populous state of Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia, where we have the Conservative Green Coalition. So this idea that basically votes at 16 is just a story for the centre left doesn't work like that anymore. In Germany, we also have the market liberal FDP that supports it. But, and that's my final point to finish on, as I said, nothing bad happens from votes at 16, but it's not always as positive as could be. And that is because there is still questions about how well we implement it. One of them is that even in Scotland, where we've seen the positive rise in turnout with a lasting effect, turnout is still, this for 16 to 31-year-olds on average, very dependent on socioeconomic class of your parents. So if your parents are in a higher socioeconomic class, you are more likely to become a habitual voter. What is incredibly interesting, though, is when we look at the 16 and 17-year-olds. This is only the 16, 17-year-olds in 2021, and we don't see the same degree of inequality yet. The inequality develops basically more in early adulthood. We found the same in 2015, but wanted to check whether that was just the referendum or what's happening now. It seems like the inequality develops more. And one of the big things that can counter the parental difference is good citizenship education in schools, but very importantly, not just the sort of citizenship education that tells you this is how law is made, but the sort of citizenship education that teaches how to discuss political issue, how to engage politically. But that is very unequal in Scotland. We have some areas in Scotland that do this a lot, and others that don't. Unfortunately, the ones that do it a lot are typically the areas with higher socioeconomic resources anyways. So at the moment, the political education system in Scotland exacerbates the inequalities rather than reducing them. So we've done some studies that demonstrate that even up to the 31-year-olds, if you remember having taken a political class in school where you discussed political issues, you're more likely to turn out later in life. So there is this positive impact of citizenship education. So again, this isn't an argument to say you can only do votes at 16 if you have this, but if you want to see some of the benefits translate more broadly, that's where some of the enhancing structures come in. But there are other dimensions. I won't go through all the technical details because I only have a minute and a half left. But we did a report on Wales. In Wales, the voting age was lowered in 2021, and there was half a year for it. Passing the law to the vote, half a year, which is a terrible thing for implementation. If you want to implement votes at 16 well, we've learned from multiple countries, you need time. Because here, within 6 months, the Electoral Commission had to set up voter registration mechanisms that didn't exist. Voter mobilization rights, because in the UK, votes at 16-year-olds are automatically registered. They first have to register themselves. So all of this had to happen super quickly during a COVID lockdown. So it wasn't bad, but the positive effects didn't really manifest. And we've seen this, we've done focus groups with young people remotely during COVID. It was quite difficult, but we did focus groups with over 100 16, 17-year-olds in Wales. And you could just tell from their statements basically that some of the positive things we saw in Scotland, engagement in schools, engagement of the media, political party outreach, that didn't take place to the same extent. So the results of Wales weren't as good. But we're now working with the Welsh government, and the Welsh government just ran a set of trials in the local elections, and Wales is shifting to automatic voter registration, partially because of the experience with young people. So there's an interesting feedback loop between this. I'm saying this, and this is my final slide. Sorry, I'm doing 1 minute over, but only one. This is my final slide. Votes at 16 in its own right isn't dangerous, but the implementation of it really matters if you want to see those positive effects. You can basically enhance existing positive things. Similarly, citizenship education is really positive in its own right, but it gets better when the 16 and 17-year-olds then also have the chance to vote. So what we've seen in schools is those young people who had good citizenship education and got the vote at 16 were the ones who were most likely to influence their parents. So we did a study on this. So you actually see kind of some of those feedback loops. So both things are good in their own right. You bring them together, you enhance those positive effects. And the very final point that I'll just briefly mention here is, if you give it more time as well, you have the chance for youth-led engagement. So one of the things we work, here examples from the campaign in Scotland, there's an amazing campaign going on in Canada at the moment that I've worked with this year. And what's really, really brilliant about it is that they managed youth-led outreach into other communities, the non-political communities, citizenship groups, youth clubs, and so on, to bring this out. But they're saying they can do this much better at age 16 because they have these sort of peer effects, school effects, and so on in there. It wouldn't work as strongly. So that is why in Canada, we get organizations like Black Vote Canada, UNICEF, and so on, supporting votes at 16 because they see it as an opportunity to engage at an earlier age, which they otherwise couldn't have. And in Scotland, we saw that one of the success stories in 2014 in terms of engagement. Right, I'm over time now, so I'll stop, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.